I'm Agnieszka Niemark, and this is the Boyce Thompson Institute Centennial Oral History Project. It's October 29, 2022. My interviewee today is Alan Renwick, Professor Emeritus at BTI. Alan, first of all, thank you so much for taking part in this project.
I'm glad to be here.
And let's start the interview with your early years at BTI. Your affiliation with the Institute started in 1960 when you joined the Institute as a research assistant with a degree in chemistry. Could you start by telling us where did you get your degree and how did you hear about the Institute? How the story started for you?
Yeah, I got my degree in a kind of an unconventional way. It was a work-study program. I went to a Dundee Technical College, and this entailed working full-time at some kind of job and taking a day off from that work to go to study, and then taking evening classes. Now, the place where I worked was the Horticultural Research Institute in a place just outside Dundee, and there I was just a peon, just working on technical things, and really not a lot of chemistry. But I was very interested in the plant side of things, and they had a nice library there with all the scientific journals, and there I found the contributions of the Boyce Thompson Institute. And I thought this was a very nice, it sounded like a nice place to work. And I was thinking at that time of emigrating to the States because the job situation in Scotland was not really very good. And I did not have any opportunity of getting an advanced degree after the way I got my degree. So I looked at the Boyce Thompson Institute and wrote a letter, not knowing who it would go to, saying that I was interested in finding a job and maybe an opportunity to go to graduate school. And to my surprise, a week later, I got a letter from the managing director, George McNew. And he said, well, it sounds like you've got an interesting background. Why don't you give us a call when you get to New York, and we'll talk about it. So I made all my arrangements, and I took all my worldly belongings in a trunk, which I took on the plane. It was, in those days, it was an old prop plane. It took 11 hours to cross the Atlantic. And when I got to New York, it was a weekend, so I spent 2 nights in a YMCA. And on Monday morning, I got up and called Boyce Thompson, and whoever I spoke to encouraged me to come up and talk to them, told me how to get on a train to the Yonkers station, and I was picked up there by Dr. Birchfield and Dr. Storrs, who were chemists at the Institute, and they had a Volkswagen Beetle. Getting my trunk into this Beetle was a major job, but they got me in and got me to the Institute. We talked for about an hour, and they said, well, it sounds as if you're qualified, we'll offer you a job. And I said, fine, when do you want me to start? He said, how about tomorrow? So they explained to me that they had a little room in the building off the library, which they kept for graduate students, and that I could live in this little room with one other graduate student. And so I moved in. I had to buy sheets and things. I had so little money with me. It was a bit of a struggle at the beginning. But I started the job there, which was kind of a crazy thing. It was looking for a method to analyze milk for 2,4-D. Now, 2,4-D is a herbicide which was discovered at Boyce Thompson, and they wanted to know whether cows eating from foliage that had been sprayed with 2,4-D, whether the 2,4-D would show up in their milk. However, this milk had been stored for so long, it was all curdled, and I had a huge job just homogenizing the milk so that I could do some analysis. But anyhow, this was my first few days, at least, at the Institute. And
so that was a very interesting start, and a very welcoming start, I must say, that you got a job and a place to stay. Could you give us a sense in general during the initial, let's say, 5 years of your life and work at BTI, when BTI was still in Yonkers, New York? You mentioned to me that you continued your education during these initial years. You were allowed to do a master's degree. Could you tell us, please, about your first assignment and how you started, how you continue your education?
Yeah, my stay with my working with Birchfield and Storrs was very informative. I learned a lot about analytical techniques. They were very good chemists, and they also did analytical work for other people in the Institute. And they suggested that I should apply at City College to go for a master's degree, which I did, and I was accepted. And of course, they weren't quite sure about how good my degree from a technical college was. And so when they heard that the City College had accepted it, they said, "Oh, we'll have to give you a raise now." so they gave me a $300 a year raise, which made it $4,500 instead of $4,200 a year. Still, I had to struggle quite a bit, but I was very fortunate that the Institute had a lady who came in to cook lunches for us. And she saw me and said, I was pretty skinny at that time, said, "You need fattening up." So she would give me extra servings. Excuse me. And when I started going into college at City College, it was evening classes. I would come home, come back to the Institute, and she would have the leftovers waiting for me in the refrigerator. So this was a very nice way to start.
And about life at Yonkers in general, did you enjoy already?
Well, I was very much welcomed. I was invited to Dr. McCallan's house for dinner, and Dr. Manu was very welcoming. I got to know a lot of people. There were quite a few young people joined at that time. Most of them just recent PhDs, a few research assistants like myself. And so there was very good social life. We had a volleyball court outside the Institute, so we played there at lunchtime. Some of us went on ski trips. We went to the World's Fair in New York in 1964, I think that was. And so I got to know people, and I got together with other bachelors, and we actually rented houses together. And some of these people became my best friends, and still are, in fact.
So it was an enjoyable time, as much as work. You mentioned also, Alan, that one of your first assignments was to learn everything in the analytical lab, I think, be well prepared for job ahead of you.
Well, most of the techniques were completely new to me, but I had to learn all the spectroscopic techniques, like UV visible, infrared spectroscopy, and separation techniques. And at that time, gas chromatography was a brand new thing. And in fact, my bosses at that time, Birchfield and Storrs, were writing a book about the biological applications of gas chromatography. And so I was really fortunate to get into that in the early stages.
Great. So I would like to discuss now the establishment of the forest entomology program.
Mm-hmm.
And what I understood is that during the first 25 years of the Institute, when Dr. William Crocker was the managing director, research at BTI focused mostly on plant physiology, plant pathology, environmental biology, and entomology. Mm-hmm. But in the late 50s, when Dr. George McNew became the managing director, the Institute became interested also in the problem of bark beetles in forest trees. Mm-hmm. So that happened just before your arrival to the Institute. Mm-hmm. And some decisions were made before your time. Mm-hmm. But do you remember the story of the establishment of the program? Especially if you could talk about the role of Fred Sears, who was the chairman of the board at the BTI at that time. That would be very interesting to just hear.
Yeah, Fred Searles was chairman of the board, and he was at the same time chairman of the board of Newmont Mining. He was a mining engineer who worked with William Boyce Thompson for many years, and when Boyce Thompson died, he took over in charge of Newmont Mining. But he was brought up in a little town called Nevada City, which is 4 miles from Grass Valley, where Newmont Mining had a gold mine, the North Star mine. And Fred Searles saw all the trees around him, many of them dying as a result of bark beetle attacks. So he really felt very strongly that the Institute ought to be working on this. And previous people at the Institute had dragged their feet a little bit on this. They were not too interested. But George McNew saw the value of it, and he saw forestry reports saying that bark beetles did 5 times as much damage as forest fires every year at that time. And so he thought it was a good idea to get into this too. And Fred Searles, from being in charge of Newmont, was able to practically donate land to the Institute in Grass Valley. The Newmont mine had closed down, and it was a nice piece of property, lots of ponderosa pine trees, and quite a lot of bark beetle activity. So it was an ideal place to get started with a research program. And the idea was that any research on this should be done in the forest where the problem was actually occurring.
So if we could explain, Alan, a little bit, like the bark beetle problem destroying forest was not a new problem. It existed already for decades. Mm-hmm. Could you talk about the problem itself and why the methods that were used previously failed? Why the problem continued? Because Sears was, as you said, trying to bring up this problem in the 40s, in the 50s, but it was a problem that existed for a long time. Can you explain that?
That's true. When the Institute first got into this, nobody knew why the methods that were being used were failing. They were essentially depending on cutting down infested trees and getting rid of them, using insecticide to kill the beetles. But of course the beetles are burrowing under the bark, so they were pretty well protected from insecticide treatments. So that was one reason that that system was not effective.
And I think also you mentioned that use of chemicals was killing also other species that then increased the population, and that
yeah, this is something that we discovered more when we moved to Texas, when the Texas program started, there we could really see that predators and parasites were coming in to infested trees, and as soon as we sprayed with insecticide, the beetles were protected, with all the predators and parasites crawling up and down the outside of the tree. They were killed.
And that was one of the main issues as well. What kind of approach the BTI decided to use to tackle the beetle problem?
Well, the first question was why one tree is more affected or more susceptible to attack than another. And so the first investigations were on tree physiology and looking at resin pressure. The natural defense of the tree is to exude resin, and that would expel beetles. But if the beetles attacked in large enough numbers, they were able to overcome this natural resistance. And so it was Dr. Vité, Jean-Pierre Vité, we called him Peter, was brought in from Germany to work on the problem, and he and a graduate student, David Wood, realized that there was something being produced as the beetles were attacking the tree that was attracting other beetles. The idea of aggregation pheromones, there was something new. The sex pheromones were known already, where the female would produce a chemical that would attract the male.
Could we talk about the operation itself at the Grass Valley laboratory? Could you explain to a person who doesn't study entomology or forestry how the research was done exactly? Because I think that's very interesting to general audience.
Well, as soon as they realized that there was something being produced by the beetles, there was an attempt to collect the volatiles that were being produced. And at the beginning, they set up great big containers and put in infested logs where the beetles were producing some kind of attractant. And then they used cold trapping and other techniques to, find out if there was something that they could isolate that they could say was responsible for this mass attraction.
So the initial work, basically, it was the isolation of the guts of the insects, right, to obtain the material.
Yeah, that came quite a bit later. Eventually, they found that there was something being produced in the guts of the attacking beetles that was being released, and then this was an attractant for other beetles in the area, and it resulted in a mass attack.
In the Grass Valley in California around 1966, just after accomplishing your master's studies. Could you tell us also how this happened, like why you decided to join the project, or who proposed to you to join the project, and also explain to us why a chemist was needed at that stage of the research.
Yeah, well, as soon as they realized that there was some kind of attractant involved, Dr. McNew, who was the director of the institute at that time, saw me with getting my degree in chemistry. He said, they need a chemist out there. So he sent me out to Grass Valley, California, and at the beginning, we tried to figure out, which sex is producing the attractant. First of all, with Ips, there are two different bark beetle species. One is Ips, which is a more secondary beetle, and then there's Dendroctonus, which is a very primary problem. And so we spent some time trying to collect volatiles from the infested logs. And eventually we found that the males of Ips were producing a pheromone. And we started some work to try to collect enough for identification of the pheromone.
When the research in California was already well advanced in the early 60s, Texas started to have a big problem with bark beetles. They had an epidemic in 1962, and some people in Texas heard about good outcomes of research in California and got in touch with BTI. What was very interesting about Texas story is that the East Texas timber industries were also looking into some new approaches to deal with bark beetle, and they were willing to put some money into establishing a new research institute. So this is how the Southern Forest Research Institute was created, and the Beaumont, Texas laboratory was established with contribution from BTI.
Mm-hmm.
Could you compare for us the two operations in California and in Texas, and what kind of outcomes this operations brought?
Oh, well, they were quite similar, but in Texas, of course, it was the southern pine beetle was a real problem. It moved very fast. There would be an infestation, and it would just take off and kill hundreds of acres of pine trees, and so we started down there. Well, first of all, we had learned that there are pheromones involved, and that we should be trying to identify these pheromones. And so when I first went down there, it was a matter of deciding, which sex of beetles is producing the pheromone, and this kind of thing. And we eventually used all the techniques that we had learned in California with the western pine beetle.
Were you able, Alan, to do the laboratory work in these locations, or did you have to bring sort of, the pheromones into bigger labs to analyze, to do the chemical analysis? How your work looked like?
The institute was provided with a lab by the forest industry down in Texas, and there was a lot of work done in the lab there, but I didn't really get involved until they knew an awful lot about which sex there was a pheromone involved, and which sex was producing it, and under what conditions and everything. So I was sent down to Texas to look into it, and we knew that the females were producing a pheromone, but not the males, and so I was able to get involved in that.
I understand that you also were quite busy between 1966 and 1970 because you decided to start your doctorate degree studies.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So could you explain the link between doing the research on pheromones and deciding to do more studies in this field to obtain PhD?
Yeah, well, obviously there was a discovery that the bark beetles were producing a pheromone, and they thought, well, since most of my training was in chemistry, I should get involved in this, and so I was doing a master's degree at City College in New York, and they agreed to have me work on the bark beetles as my research project, and at that time we knew that male bark beetle. Well, there are different species of that we were working with. The but the most important one in Texas was the southern pine beetle, which is where the female is producing a pheromone. And so I got involved in trying to isolate the pheromone from the female beetles. In the case of, there's a secondary bark beetles called ips. The ips beetles, it's the male produces a pheromone which attracts other males to the same tree. And so and a lot of the early work was just trying to isolate the volatiles that were being produced by these beetles and figuring out which ones were involved in the whole process of attraction to one. There'd be a mass attack of a single tree. And so these pheromones, we got involved in.
And how come you decided to obtain a degree in forestry in Germany? Apparently, Dr. McNew played some role in encouraging you to do so?
Oh, he certainly did. And of course, Dr. Vitae was in charge of the forestry program, and he encouraged me. They were looking for someone who had some chemistry background, who could identify some of the chemicals that were involved in mass attraction of beetles to a particular tree. Yeah.
Okay, so you decided to
So
go ahead?
I decided that I needed to get an advanced degree, and this was a good way to get it.
In 1978, BTI decided to move to Ithaca from Yonkers. And the forestry program was already discontinued. You decided to work on some new species, among them some crucifer insects, and also a spacing mechanism that you, I guess, observed with the beetles. Can you tell us about the new research that started when the BTI moved to Ithaca?
Oh, well, I guess I had the idea that many insects have different ways of finding their host plants and different ways of spacing and so on. And I worked, I'm trying to think what I worked with first. This is a long way back. Let's see.
You mentioned to me, I think, at the beginning, the cabbage looper and the recognition of cabbage plant and spacing of eggs on the plant was one of your...
That's true, yeah. That was one of the things. The spacing mechanisms, which we had learned from bark beetles, was an issue. And,
Can you also tell us about your role in managing the analytical lab here at Cornell? Why you were assigned with...
of course, I was already in charge of the analytical lab in Yonkers before we made the move to Cornell. And I continued here. We got a mass spectrometer, which was something new to me. And I learned quite a lot about that. And gas chromatography was one of my major things. And gas chromatography, mass spectrometry combination was something that I really got into. And that was very useful for identifying any biologically active compounds.
So it looks like you continue to do research about the relationship between the plants and insects. And in the late 70s and 1980s, when Dr. Wellman was the managing director at BTI, also he pushed the idea of organizing some international programs. Can you tell us about the research program that you established together with Patrick Hughes and Frank Messina in Cameroon? And the seed beetle that was a problem in Cameroon, or I think it's also called cowpea weevil.
Cowpea weevil, yeah. This was an interesting project. we made trips to Cameroon, and I'm trying to. This is a long time ago. Trying to think what the main focus was, but the main problem was storage, and cowpea weevils were a big problem in storage, and so we got involved in looking at oviposition, the egg laying by cowpea weevils, and this was a major problem. I don't know how much more I can say about that.
Okay, Alan. Let's move to a more general question. Maybe that will be easier for you to handle. When BTI moved to Ithaca and found home at Cornell University, that also opened some new opportunities for scientists at BTI to collaborate with other departments and research institutions affiliated with Cornell. Could you talk a bit about your collaboration with the entomology department, and I think you also mentioned ecology, that it was also quite close to the research that you were doing. Just give us some examples of this collaboration.
Yeah, well, and I was really welcomed by the entomology department here, because I was essentially a chemical ecologist, which and with experience with bark beetles, and knowing that there are pheromones that attracts different sexes, and the entomology department was interested in having people work on pheromones, and so I got involved. Well, first with the bark beetles, and and then with some other insects. One of the ones I worked with most at the beginning was the cabbage butterflies, and then the cabbage looper. Cabbage butterflies were not quite so interesting, because there wasn't much chemistry there. It was a visual thing that they would land on a plant and lay an egg. Cabbage looper was another insect I worked with, which was a little more interesting. There were different sexes produced different compounds, and so on.
And you mentioned that in the 1990s, when you work on various butterflies, you even share postgraduate, post-PhD, postdoctorate students with ecology department to do some research?
Yeah.
Was that a quite close collaboration?
Yeah. No, I was very happy to have the students come in, and we worked on the cabbage butterfly, the cabbage looper, and other crucifer insects. And
how come you became a first adjunct professor at entomology department? It was for the first time I understood that a BTI scientist was offered this kind of position.
Yeah.
What that involved, if you could?
Well, I think that the entomology department was a little reluctant to offer these adjunct positions, and they realized that since I was really just a chemist, I wasn't any kind of threat to them, and so they were quite happy to have me join them.
Is that a research position, or is that a teaching position?
It was just research, and taking on graduate students for research, of course.